In the autumn of 1885, somewhere in the quiet hills of rural Pennsylvania, a photographer named Edmund Hale set up his heavy wooden camera and told a family of 7 to hold perfectly still. He counted to 3. The shutter clicked. And in that single frozen second, a secret was sealed inside a photograph that would not fully surface for over 100 years. The photo looks ordinary at first glance. A father in a stiff collar. A mother with tired eyes. 4 children arranged by height along the edges, and in the very center there is one child, smaller than the rest, dressed differently, seated apart, as if the space around them was deliberate, as if someone had made a decision. That child has no name in the family records, no birth certificate, no grave marker, just a face in the center of a photo that a family spent generations quietly hoping no one would ask about. When a historian named Clara Voss stumbled onto this photograph in 2019 inside a water-damaged estate box, she thought she had found a simple family portrait. She had no idea she was holding the beginning of one of the most quietly devastating stories of the 19th century. A story involving a stolen identity, a buried confession, a child who was not what they appeared to be, and a family secret so carefully guarded that even the children who grew up in that house never knew the full truth. What follows is their story, reconstructed from letters, land records, and the faded evidence left behind by people who believed silence was the same thing as safety. Disclaimer. The story you are about to read is a work of fiction, inspired loosely by themes from historical research. All names, characters, events, and specific details are entirely fictional and created for storytelling purposes only. Any resemblance to real persons, living or dead, is purely coincidental. Chapter 1. The box that should have stayed closed. The estate sale was not supposed to matter. Clara Voss had driven 2 hours from Philadelphia on a grey October morning, not because she expected to find anything significant, but because she could not stop herself. That was the thing about being a historical researcher for 16 years. You develop a kind of low hum inside you, a frequency that goes quiet only when you are moving towards something old and forgotten. And old estate sales in rural Pennsylvania always seemed to turn that frequency back on. The Caldwell property had been on the market for 3 years before the family finally agreed to sell. The house itself was a 2-story colonial that had not seen a serious repair since the 1960s. The wallpaper was peeling in long strips. The floorboards groaned with every step. The kind of house that looks like it has been quietly asking to be left alone for a very long time. Clara paid $12 at the front table and was given a yellow sticker and a number. She moved through rooms that smelled of mildew and old wood, running her fingers along shelves of mismatched dishes and water-stained paperbacks. She was not expecting anything. She found the box behind a collapsed shelf in the back corner of what had probably been a study. It was not much to look at. A tin container, roughly the size of a shoebox, its edges brown with rust and its lid warped from moisture. Someone had once sealed it with a length of twine that had long since rotted through. Clara carried it to a folding table near the window and opened it. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that was still somehow intact, was a small collection of papers, 2 folded letters, a single iron key, and a photograph mounted on cardboard. The cardboard was the kind photographers used in the 1880s, thick and dark-bordered, with the studio name embossed in faded gold at her bottom. Edmund Hale, photographer, Harwich Station, Pennsylvania. The photograph showed a family, 7 people, a formal arrangement, the kind you sat for once and kept for forever. Clara studied each face slowly, the way she always did with old photographs, reading them the way you might read a page of text. The father, the mother, the children arranged by height, and then her eyes settled on the child in the center. Something about that child made her pause. She could not immediately explain what it was. A placement, a posture, a certain quality in the expression that felt slightly off in a way she could not name, like a word you recognize but cannot quite pronounce. She set the photograph aside and unfolded the first of the 2 letters. The handwriting was cramped and careful, the ink brown with age. She had to tilt the paper toward the window light to read it. She read 3 lines, then stopped. Read them again. Slowly. Then she sat down on the nearest dusty chair and read the entire letter from beginning to end, without looking up once. When she finished, she looked at the photograph again, at the child in the center. The frequency inside her had gone completely silent, not because she had found nothing, but because she had found something she was not at all prepared for. If you want to understand what Clara discovered in that letter, you need to go back. Not just to 1885 and the day that photograph was taken. You need to go back further. To the spring of 1883, in the same quiet Pennsylvania hills, when a man named George Aldrich made a decision that set everything in motion. Stay with us, because this story is just getting started, and what you think happened is almost certainly not what happened at all. If this story is already pulling you in, please consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell so you never miss a story like this one. There are more. Hidden histories waiting, and you deserve to know them. Next, we discover the man at the center of it all, George Aldrich, and the one decision in the spring of 1883 that quietly destroyed everything he had spent his life trying to build. Chapter 2. The man who made one terrible decision. George Aldrich was not a villain. That is important to say and difficult to say because the things he did were not small. But if you try to understand this story by casting him as a simple bad man, you will miss everything that makes it matter. George Aldrich was something more complicated and more human than a villain. He was a man who loved his family so completely, that when he finally understood the size of the problem facing them, he made the worst possible choice for what he believed were the best possible reasons. He was 36 years old in the spring of 1883. He had come to Harwich Station 11 years earlier with $40, a horse, and a letter of introduction from a cousin who knew a man who had land to lease. He had built a farm through years of work that left calluses on his hands thick enough to strike a match on. He had married a woman named Ruth. They had 4 children. The oldest was 14. The youngest was barely 3. By most measures, George Aldrich had done what was expected of a man of his time and place. He had survived, and in surviving had created something, a household, a name, a small but real presence in the community. He served on the church committee. He was trusted by his neighbors. When men in Harwich Station shook his hand, they meant it. The problem that arrived in the spring of 1883 came in the form of a letter, as so many problems do. It was from his brother James, who lived in Ohio and who had not written in over 2 years. George sat at the kitchen table on a Tuesday evening in late April and read the letter while Ruth washed dishes at the basin behind him. He read it once. Then he folded it and placed it in his shirt pocket and said nothing for the rest of the night. The letter told him 2 things. The first was that James had died unexpectedly of a fever 3 weeks earlier. The second was that James had left behind a child, a daughter, 7 years old. Her name, according to the letter which had been written by James's landlady, was Eliza. Her mother had died 2 years prior. There were no other relatives. The landlady was not unkind, but she was also not in a position to keep a child indefinitely. She was writing to George because he was the only Aldrich she knew how to find. George Aldrich sat with that letter in his pocket for 3 days before he told Ruth. Ruth's response was immediate and unambiguous. They would bring the child. Of course they would. She was family. There was no question about it. Ruth was that kind of woman. Her certainty on matters of right conduct was one of the things George had loved about her from the beginning. But George was already thinking ahead to something Ruth was not considering, something that had begun forming in his mind the moment he read the letter. A plan, or the shape of a plan, a solution that seemed, in the privacy of his own thoughts, almost elegant. Eliza would need papers if she was to have any standing in the world. Birth certificates, family records, the small official documents that determined who a person was allowed to be. James had left nothing. The landlady had nothing. Eliza existed in the world at that moment as almost nothing at all. And George Aldrich had a daughter of his own who had died 3 months earlier, a baby girl only 19 months old, taken by fever before she had been more than a whisper in the household. Her name had been entered in the church birth registry. She had a small grave at the edge of the Aldrich property. Her name was also Eliza. That is where the plan began. And that is where, in a very quiet and very devastating way, everything else followed. Next, we discover what George told the church registrar, what Ruth almost said, and how a 7-year-old girl from Ohio became someone she had never been, in a town where no one was supposed to ask questions. Before we go deeper, understand this. This story isn't for everyone. If you're still here, you're one of the few who can face what America buried. Subscribe now, and tell me in the comments, what state are you listening from? And would you dare hear this story from your own backyard? Chapter 3. The name they gave her and the name she forgot. The journey from Ohio took 4 days. George made it alone. Ruth stayed with the children in Harwich Station, which was the practical thing, but it was also perhaps the easier thing. She had agreed to the plan. She had said yes in that quiet way she had, that was not quite agreement and not quite refusal, but somewhere in the careful middle where women of that era were often required to live. She had said yes because the alternative was a 7-year-old girl in a boarding house in Ohio with nowhere to go, and Ruth Aldrich could not hold that image in her mind for more than a few seconds without wanting to fix it. But she had also said yes without fully reckoning with what it meant. That reckoning would come later. For now, she made extra bread and told the children their cousin was coming to stay. George arrived in Columbus on a Wednesday and found the address the landlady had given him. It was a narrow house on a street that smelled of coal smoke and dried mud. The landlady was a wide woman named Mrs. Potts, who spoke with a brisk efficiency that suggested she had not had time to be sentimental about much in her life. She showed George into a small back room, where a girl sat on the edge of a cot, her hands folded in her lap. Eliza. George had been prepared to feel obligation. He had not been prepared for the specific quality of the child's silence, the way she looked at him with dark, careful eyes, as though she were already assessing whether he was someone worth trusting. She looked older than 7. She looked like someone who had already learned that the world did not always explain itself before acting. He told her his name. He told her he was her uncle. He told her she was going to come live with his family in Pennsylvania with her cousins, and that she would be safe and cared for. He used those words specifically, safe and cared for. He had rehearsed them. Eliza said nothing for a long moment. Then she asked where her father was. George told her that her father had died, that he was very sorry, that she was not alone. She nodded once, slowly, the way children nod when they have already suspected the answer to a question and are simply confirming it. Then she picked up a small cloth bag from the floor beside the cot, which appeared to contain everything she owned, and stood up as if to say she was ready when he was. They left the next morning. It was somewhere on the journey back, in the second day of travel, that George began to explain the other part. He did it carefully. He had thought about how to say it. He told Eliza that when they arrived, people would know her as his daughter, not his niece. His daughter. He told her that this was the safest way, that it would make her life simpler, that it was for her benefit as much as anyone's. He told her the name they would use was still Eliza, but the family name would be Aldrich, and the record that already existed in the Harwich Station church registry for a baby girl named Eliza Aldrich, who had died at 19 months, would now belong to her. He was asking a 7-year-old to become a ghost wearing another child's name. Eliza listened to all of this without interrupting. When he finished, she looked out the window of the coach at the flat Ohio farmland passing by and said only one thing. She asked if she had to forget her real name. George told her it would be better if she did. She turned back to the window and did not speak again for the rest of that day. What George did not understand, and would not understand for years, was that she had not forgotten anything, that she had simply stored it in a place where no one would look, and that children who learn to carry secrets early in life often carry them with extraordinary care. Next, we discover how Eliza settled into the Aldrich house, what the older children suspected, and the single afternoon that planted a seed that would take 30 years to grow into something that could not be ignored. Chapter 4. The House That Kept Its Mouth Shut. Ruth Aldrich was a practical woman, And practical women understand something that people who have never had to be practical sometimes miss. That love and arrangement are not the same thing, but they can exist in the same house, and sometimes you cannot fully untangle one from the other. She took Eliza in with both arms and no visible hesitation. She gave her the small bedroom at the end of the hall, the one with the window that looked east toward the apple trees. She introduced her to the other children as their cousin come to live with them, which was technically accurate if you interpreted cousin loosely, and she put a bowl of oatmeal in front of her the first morning, as though Eliza had always been there and always would be. The other children were a mixed response. Thomas, who was 14 and already developing the guarded self-sufficiency of a boy who would one day be a difficult man to know, looked at Eliza across the breakfast table with an expression that could only be described as assessing. He did not say anything rude, but he also did not offer anything warm. He simply measured her. Margaret, who was 12 and deeply interested in the emotional temperature of every room she entered, immediately decided that Eliza was fascinating and began following her around the house with the subtle persistence of someone conducting a quiet investigation. The two younger children, Samuel, who was 8, and little Henry, who was not quite 4, accepted Eliza with the uncomplicated ease that small children often extend to new arrivals, which is to say they absorbed her into their existing world without any particular ceremony or suspicion. But it was Thomas and Margaret who would matter most, particularly Margaret. The days settled into a pattern. George went on with the farm, Ruth managed the house, Eliza moved through the rhythms of the household with a quietness that impressed some people and unsettled others. She was not unhappy, or if she was, she arranged her unhappiness so neatly inside herself that it did not disturb the surfaces. She was helpful, she was attentive. She learned the geography of the house and the farm with the careful thoroughness of someone who understood that knowing your surroundings was a form of protection. She also held on to things, small things, a way of saying certain words that was not quite Pennsylvania, an occasional pause before she answered a question, as if she were translating from something else. Once, in the kitchen, she absent-mindedly hummed a melody that Ruth did not recognize and that made her stop in the middle of rolling dough and look at the child for a moment longer than usual. The afternoon that planted the seed came 6 weeks after Eliza arrived. It was a Saturday in late June, warm and heavy with humidity. George was in the lower field. Ruth had taken Henry to a neighbor's house and asked Margaret to watch the younger children. Thomas had gone off somewhere on his own, as Thomas often did. Margaret found Eliza in the small study off the sitting room, which was not really a study anymore, but served as the place where George kept his papers and his ledgers. Eliza was not touching anything. She was standing very still in front of the shelf where George kept a small collection of documents, looking at them. Margaret asked her what she was doing. Eliza said she was just looking. Margaret asked her if she was looking for something. There was that pause again, the translation pause, and then Eliza said something that Margaret would remember for the rest of her life. She said she was looking to see if there was anything with her real name on it. Margaret did not understand what that meant. She was 12, and 12 is old enough to know that some questions should be asked and some shouldn't. She felt instinctively that this was one of the shouldn't kind, so she said nothing. She simply filed it away in the part of herself where she kept the things that didn't have explanations yet. She would not take it back out again for a very long time, but she never forgot it. Next, we discover what happened at the church the following year, why a single question from the registrar nearly unraveled everything, and what George whispered to Ruth that night that she carried with her for the rest of her marriage. Chapter 5. The registrar's question. The Church of St. Andrews in Harwich Station kept meticulous records. This was due almost entirely to one man, a clerk and voluntary registrar named Arthur Buell, who had served the church in this administrative capacity for 22 years and who approached the maintenance of its documents with a devotion that most people reserve for things they genuinely love. Births, deaths, marriages, baptisms. Arthur Buell recorded them all in his steady, looping hand, and he cross-referenced them, and he worried over inconsistencies the way some people worry over unpaid debts. He was not a suspicious man, exactly, but he was a thorough one. It was in the late spring of 1884, roughly a year after Eliza had arrived, that Arthur Buell came to the Aldrich farm on what he described as a routine matter. He sat at the kitchen table with his hat in his lap and his ledger open in front of him, and explained, in his measured way, that he had been conducting a general review of the parish records and had noticed what he called a small discrepancy. Ruth brought him tea. George sat across from him with his hands flat on the table. The discrepancy, Arthur said, was this. The death record for a child named Eliza Aldrich, recorded in March of 1882 at 19 months of age, appeared in the registry, but so did an existing notation in the birth registry for the same child, also recording her baptism. And yet Mr. Buell had recently been told that the Aldrichs had a daughter, Eliza, currently living in the home, a girl of now approximately 8 years of age. He said this without accusation. He was simply noting the arithmetic. The dates did not quite work. Could Mr. Aldrich help him understand? It was the moment George had spent over a year quietly dreading. He had prepared for it in the way anxious people prepare, by rehearsing various versions of an explanation in his head until one of them felt smooth enough to say aloud. He told Arthur Buell that there had been a clerical error at the time of his niece's arrival, that she had come to live with them following the death of his brother in Ohio, and that given her age and the informality of the arrangement, the existing family records had simply been used as a matter of convenience. He said it simply and steadily, and looked Arthur Buell in the eye throughout. Arthur Buell wrote something in his ledger, asked one clarifying question about the brother's name, wrote something else. Then he closed the ledger, drank the last of his tea, thanked Ruth, and said he believed the matter was resolved. He put on his hat and left. George did not speak for the remainder of the afternoon. That night, after the children were in bed, he sat with Ruth at the kitchen table and spoke to her in a very low voice about what he had done. Not the lie, she already knew about the lie, but the weight of it, the specific and growing weight of carrying a false thing forward into more and more time. He told her that he had not understood, when he made the plan, how much heavier it would become with every year that passed. How the further they got from the original moment, the less reversible it became. Ruth listened. She did not tell him that she had known this from the beginning, though she had. She did not tell him that the cost of the plan was always going to be paid by Eliza, not by them. She did not say any of these things, because saying them would not have changed the past, and Ruth Aldrich was, above all, a practical woman. She took his hand across the table and held it in both of hers. She told him that Eliza was safe and fed and learning and as settled as a child in that situation could be. She told him that they would not be undone by Arthur Buell's ledger. She told him that what mattered now was moving forward carefully. George nodded. He believed her, because he needed to. What neither of them knew was that Arthur Buell, for all his thoroughness, had not entirely been satisfied by the explanation. He had simply chosen, for reasons that remained his own, to write down what he was told and say nothing more. For now. Next, we discover what Arthur Buell did with his private doubts, and why the photograph that would eventually reach Clara Voss's hands was taken in the first place. Chapter 6. Why Edmund Hale set up his camera that day. The autumn of 1885 came on slowly, the way Pennsylvania autumns do, with the cold arriving in the mornings first and the afternoons holding on to warmth for as long as they could. Edmund Hale had been traveling the county roads with his portable studio for 6 years by then. He was a quiet man with large hands and an unhurried manner, the kind of person who could make a nervous subject feel calm simply by moving through a space without urgency. He had photographed families in parlors and on front steps and under oak trees and in the middle of harvested fields. He had developed a sense for the particular kind of stillness that a family produced when asked to represent itself officially to the future. He came to the Aldrich farm at the invitation of George, who had written to him through the county postal office. The occasion, according to the letter George sent, was simply this. The family wished to have a portrait made. No special occasion was mentioned. Edmund arrived on a Thursday in late October, set up his equipment in the side yard where the afternoon light fell cleanly without shadow, and arranged the family according to his practiced sense of composition. The father and mother at the back, the children in descending height at the edges, and in the center, because the center was the compositional anchor, because the eye of anyone looking at the photograph would naturally be drawn there first, he placed the smallest of the children, the one who held herself with that particular quietness he had noticed immediately. He had photographed enough families to understand that they were never simply what they appeared. A formal portrait was an official version of a thing. The actual thing was always slightly different. He did not ask questions about this because it was not his business, and because in his experience, the official version and the actual thing were both true in their own ways. He told the family to hold still. He counted to 3. The shutter clicked. He made 2 exposures, because he always made 2. The first was in case something went wrong with the development. The second was for the same reason. He mounted them on the dark bordered cardboard with his studio name in faded gold and left 1 copy with the family. The second copy, and this is the part that matters, he took home with him. Edmund Hale had a habit that he never discussed with anyone. When he photographed a family and felt that unnamed quality of slight displacement, that almost wrongness that had no name, he made a private note on the back of his own copy of the photograph, a small observational record. Not an accusation, not a suspicion, just a notation. On the back of the Aldrich photograph in pencil, he wrote 3 words. The child. Different. He filed it with his other records. He moved on to his next appointment. He did not contact anyone about it. He was a photographer, not an authority. It was not his place. But he kept the photograph, and his records survived him, passed to a nephew who had no particular interest in old photographs, but also could not bring himself to throw them away. And the nephew's things were eventually consolidated into a storage box, and the storage box sat in an attic in rural Pennsylvania for several decades. And then an estate sale was announced. Back in the Aldrich house, Ruth hung the mounted photograph in the sitting room. She looked at it sometimes in the evenings, after the children had gone to bed, in that particular kind of private taking stock that people do when the house is finally quiet. She looked at Eliza in the center of the photograph. She thought about what it meant to be placed at the center of something you had not chosen to be a part of. She thought about what a child carried when the people around her decided, for good and complicated reasons, to make her into someone slightly different than who she was. She thought about the iron key that she had sewn into the lining of a small cloth bag and hidden in the back of her sewing chest. The key that George did not know she had. The key that she had found in Eliza's original cloth bag from Ohio and removed without telling anyone. She had not yet decided what to do with it, but she had kept it, because Ruth Aldrich, for all her practicality, understood that some things needed to be preserved, even if no one was sure yet what they were for. Next, we discover what that key opened, and why Eliza, now a young woman of 17, began asking questions that no one in the Aldrich house was prepared to answer. Chapter 7. The Girl Who Started Asking. By the time Eliza was 17, she had grown into someone who listened more than she spoke, which in a household as busy and layered as the Aldrichs had become was a considerable advantage. She had not forgotten. This is the thing that the family had perhaps been quietly counting on, that the passage of time does to children what it does to most things, which is soften them, blur the edges, replace what was with the slow accumulation of what is. They had perhaps hoped that Eliza would eventually simply be Eliza Aldrich, the way you become the name you are called long enough, the way a place becomes home by virtue of being the place you are in. But Eliza was 17, and she was not blurred. She was, if anything, sharper than she had been at 7, because she had spent 10 years quietly adding to the archive that lived in the careful inner place where she kept the things that did not have a place in the official version of herself. She knew, though no one had told her explicitly, that the story she had been given was incomplete. She knew this the way you know the weight of something is wrong before you pick it up. She knew it from the translation pauses and the unfamiliar melody, and the small cloth bag that she had noticed some years ago was slightly lighter than she remembered it being. She began asking questions in the way that careful people ask questions, not directly, not in ways that announced themselves as questions, but sideways, through angles, folded into ordinary conversation. She asked Thomas, who was now 28 and living on his own property, but still came for Sunday dinners, whether he remembered anything about Ohio. Thomas went still in a way that had nothing to do with thinking. He said he had never been to Ohio, which was true, and changed the subject, which told her something. She asked Margaret Witt. O was the most likely of the Aldrich children to give her something real about their father's family. Margaret, who had carried her own archive since that Saturday in June 11 years ago, looked at her sister, at her cousin, at this person she had loved without being quite sure what to call what they were to each other, and said carefully that she didn't know much about that side of the family. Which was also true, and also an answer of a kind. Eliza went to the sitting room photograph and looked at it for a long time. She had looked at it many times over the years, but now she looked at it differently. She looked at the deliberateness of the arrangement. She looked at the center, where she sat, and she thought about the word deliberate, and she thought about what it meant to put something deliberately in the center of a frame. She found the cloth bag in Ruth's sewing chest on a Tuesday in November, when Ruth had gone to town and Eliza was helping to tidy the bedroom. She recognized it immediately. She had not seen it in 10 years, but she recognized it the way you recognize a thing that belonged to you before you were old enough to keep track of your belongings. She opened it and found the key. She held it in her palm for a long moment, this small iron thing. It was old, older than her time in the Aldrich house. It had come with her from Ohio, from her father's lodging, from the life before. It was not a house key. It was too small for that. It had the look of a key to a box or a chest or a small locked compartment of some kind. She put it back. She straightened the sewing chest. She said nothing when Ruth returned from town. But she had the shape of it now, the size of it, the weight of it in her hand. And she began quietly to think about what she was going to do. Next, we discover what Ruth did when she realized the key had been found and the conversation she holds Addie with George that night that changed the direction of everything that came after.
In 1880s America, nearly 1 in 5 children died before their first birthday. Brief pause, that means in a family with 5 children, statistically, 1 would not survive infancy. Fever, diphtheria, cholera, scarlet fever. Death came fast and it came early, and most families simply lived inside that reality as a quiet, constant fact of life. In Pennsylvania in the 1880s, there was no statewide system for recording births and deaths. The state did not require official civil registration until 1906. Before that, church records were the primary proof that a person had ever existed, and those records were written by hand, kept by local clergy, and were shockingly easy to alter, lose, or misuse. By 1885, the family portrait photograph had become something close to an official family document. Taken on cabinet cards mounted on thick dark cardboard with the photographer's name embossed at the bottom, these images were displayed in parlors, handed to relatives, and in some cases used to establish family identity in legal disputes. The photograph was how a family told the world, "This is who we are."
Chapter 8. The night Ruth finally spoke. Ruth Aldrich had known for a long time that the conversation was coming. She had known it in the abstract way you know things you are not ready for, holding the knowledge at a slight distance, telling yourself that the right moment has not yet arrived. And then one day you come back from town, and something in the quality of the silence in your house tells you that the right moment has already been and gone, and you have simply been standing on the wrong side of it. She noticed it before she found proof. The sewing chest was exactly as she had left it. The cloth bag was exactly where she had put it. The key was in the bag. She had checked with the practiced quickness of someone who checks things regularly, and everything was in its place. But the air in the room was different. It was the air of a place that had recently been inhabited by a specific kind of attention. Ruth had spent 17 years learning to read the particular atmospheres that children created in spaces when they had been looking for something. She sat on the edge of the bed for a while. She thought about what it meant that Eliza had found the key and said nothing. That was not the behavior of a child who had stumbled on something by accident. That was the behavior of someone who was assembling a picture carefully, piece by piece, before they decided what to do with it. She thought about what it meant to be Eliza, 17 years old. Smart in that sideways way that some people are smart, through accumulation and patience rather than through speed. Carrying a self that had been renamed at 7 years old and had never, as far as Ruth could tell, actually accepted the renaming in the way George had hoped. She thought about the letter she had found in the oilcloth with the photograph, the one she had never shown George, the one she had written herself, late at night, at the kitchen table, 3 years into Eliza's time with them. A letter explaining everything in the careful and thorough way that Ruth did things. Everything George had told her, everything she had worked out herself, everything she thought Eliza deserved to eventually know. She had not been sure, when she wrote it, who it was for, whether it was a confession or a safeguard, or simply the practical act of a woman who understood that secrets carried only in the body of one person are dangerously fragile. She told George that night, not about the letter, not yet, but about the key, about Eliza having found it, about the quality of the silence in the house. George's response was to go very still in his chair. He was 50 years old now. The farm had done well. The children were grown, or mostly grown. The particular crisis of 1883 had receded into the past in the way that crises eventually do when nothing comes of them. He had allowed himself, gradually, the slow comfort of believing it was resolved. He looked at Ruth and asked what she thought they should do. Ruth said she thought they should tell Eliza the truth. George asked what that would mean, for the records, for the legality of it, for the life Eliza had built. Ruth said that Eliza had not been given the chance to build her own life, that the life she was living was built on a foundation that belonged to someone else, and that a foundation you do not know about is one you cannot trust. George was quiet for a long time. He asked if this was what Ruth had always wanted, to tell her. Ruth said that what she had always wanted was to go back to the kitchen table in April of 1883 and talk to him properly before he made up his mind. But since that was not available to them, this was the next best thing. George looked at the sitting room through the open doorway, at the photograph on the wall, at the child in the sea. Enter, who was now a young woman in this house, who was now asking questions through the careful angles of someone who already suspected the answer. He said he would think about it. Ruth said that was fine, but she said it in a tone that told him thinking was not the same as deciding, and that the deciding part needed to happen soon. Next, we discover what George wrote in the letter that he slipped under Eliza's door, and why it was not at all what she expected. Chapter 9. The letter under the door. He wrote it 3 times. The first version was too long and too explanatory, and read, George felt when he reviewed it, like a man defending himself, which he was, but not in the way a letter should show. He burned that one in the fireplace before Ruth was awake. The second version was too short, 3 sentences. It felt like an evasion dressed up as directness. He held it in his hands and reread it and understood that it said almost nothing, and that what it did say, it said badly. He burned that one too. The third version took him most of a morning. He sat at the kitchen table while Ruth was in the garden and the house was quiet, and he wrote it in a slow and considered hand, crossing out occasionally, replacing words, finding the version of himself on the page that was neither defending nor evading, but simply acknowledging. He told her he was her uncle, not her father, that he had known this from the beginning and had made a decision, for reasons he still believed were practical even if they had not been right, to arrange things the way he had. He told her that her father was his brother James, that James had died in Ohio in the spring of 1883, that she had come to the Aldrich house with a cloth bag and a key, and a name that was already hers. He told her that the name she had been given in Harwich Station had belonged to a child of his own who had died before either of them had the chance to know her properly. He told her that this was not something he was asking her forgiveness for, because he understood he had no right to ask for that, but that he was telling her because Ruth had made him understand that the telling was not optional anymore. He told her that the key in the cloth bag was her father's, that he had not known what it opened, that Ruth had kept it because Ruth kept things that might matter later, and that this was, in his view, one of the reasons Ruth was a better person than he was. He told her at the end that whatever she chose to do with this information, the family she had grown up inside was real, that Thomas and Margaret and Samuel and Henry were not a performance. that the meals and the winters and the arguments and the work and the Sunday dinners were all true, regardless of the document. He folded the letter and slid it under her door at night, after she had gone to her room, and after Ruth had fallen asleep, and after the house had gone quiet in the way it only went quiet very late, when even the ordinary sounds of the building had settled. Then he went back to bed and lay on his back, staring at the ceiling. Eliza found the letter in the morning. She read it sitting on the edge of her bed before dawn, in the dark almost, the paper close to the faint light from the window. She read it once quickly. Then she read it again slowly. Then she sat with it on her lap and looked at the window for a long time. She had expected on some level confirmation. She had been building toward it for years, but the particular shape of the confirmation, the brother who had died, the baby who had died before her, the deliberate decision made at a kitchen table by a man who loved his family and was afraid, was not what she had rehearsed. It was more human than she had rehearsed, more complicated. Less of a clean wrongness and more of a heavy, tangled, understandable wrongness that did not make it right but made it harder to hold at a simple distance. She got up. She got dressed. She went downstairs. Ruth was at the basin. She turned when she heard Eliza come in. They looked at each other. Eliza asked if George was still in bed. Ruth said yes. Eliza said she was going to go to the study and look through the papers again. The real papers this time. She said it without hostility, but she said it clearly. Ruth stepped aside from the basin and gestured toward the hallway as if to say, "Of course, go ahead." Next, we discover what Eliza found in her father's papers and what the iron key unlocked, and why the answer was both smaller and far larger than anyone expected. Chapter 10. What the key opened. The papers in the study were organized in George's methodical way, by year, in folders of brown paper tied with string. Eliza had looked at them before, years ago, when she was looking for her real name, but she had been looking with a child's eyes then, moving quickly, hoping for something obvious. Now she moved differently. She moved the way someone moves when they know approximately what they are looking for, which is slower and more deliberate and more likely to find it. She found a bundle of letters from Ohio in the folder marked 1883. Most of them were from James, and reading them was its own quiet grief, recognizing the handwriting of a father she had not known long enough to miss in the specific way that memory allows. They were ordinary letters mostly, reports on the weather, on work, on money, on the general character of a modest life, the letters of a man who did not expect anyone to find them extraordinary. Near the back of the bundle, wrapped separately in a piece of oilcloth that matched the piece in the estate box she would never know about, was a different letter. It was not from James. It was addressed to James, in a hand that was formal and slightly cramped. It was from a man named Howard Selby, an attorney in Columbus. The letter was dated February of 1882, just over a year before James's death. It informed James that a matter relating to the estate of a Mrs. Catherine Aldrich, formerly of Pittsburgh, had been resolved and that the item in question had been transferred to Mr. James Aldrich as the sole surviving heir. It referred to a lockbox, described as a black iron box with a fitted key containing documents of personal significance to the family. A black iron box, a fitted key. Eliza sat back. She looked at the key in her hand, which she had taken from the cloth bag that morning before coming downstairs. She closed, had her fingers around it, and thought about what it meant that this key had traveled from Pittsburgh to Columbus, to the cloth bag of a 7-year-old girl to a Pennsylvania farm, and had been sitting in a sewing chest for 10 years, waiting for someone to hold it the right way. She spent 2 days looking for the box. She was methodical about it, the way she was methodical about most things. She checked the study. She checked the cellar. She checked the barn loft. She asked Ruth quietly if she knew of a black iron box among the things that had come from Ohio. Ruth said she did not, but she said it in a way that suggested she was answering only the literal question. It was Margaret, finally, who told her. Margaret, who had carried her own small archive for 12 years. Margaret, who had watched and filed and said nothing, waiting for the moment when saying something would mean something. She told Eliza that when George had brought her from Ohio, there had been a case brought with the other belongings. A small case, locked. George had stored it in the cellar under the root shelf. Margaret had seen it as a child and been told it was nothing and had filed the word nothing in the place where she kept the things that were not nothing. The box was still there, dusty, cobwebbed, exactly as George had placed it. He had not opened it because he had not known about the key. He had stored it and forgotten it or decided not to think about it. The key fit perfectly. Inside the box were three things: a deed to a small parcel of land in Allegheny County, made out to Catherine Aldrich and dated 1869, a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon, which Eliza would read later and which would tell her more than she was prepared for about her grandmother and the life she had lived, and a photograph. This photograph was older than the one in the Aldrich sitting room. A small, worn, oval portrait, on tin, a woman, dressed in the fashion of the 1860s. On the back, in faded ink, two words: "Your mother." Eliza held the tintype in both hands and looked at the face of her grandmother, who had left this box for her son, who had left it for his daughter, who had held a key for 10 years without knowing what it was for. She sat on the cellar floor for a long time. Next, we discover what Eliza decided to do with what she found, and why the decision she made was more generous than anyone who had kept her secret might have expected or deserved. Chapter 11. The decision that surprised everyone. She could have left. That is the thing that needs to be said plainly, because it is the thing that defines what Eliza chose. She could have taken the box, the letters, the deed to the land in Allegheny County, the tintype of her grandmother, and the knowledge of who she actually was, and she could have walked out of the Aldrich house and started the process of becoming herself again by legal means. She was 17. She was not without resources. She was sharper than people gave her credit for, and she had spent 10 years learning the geography of a difficult situation. She did not leave. What she did instead was go back upstairs with the box under her arm and set it on the kitchen table and wait for George to come in from the morning's work. He came in at 8:30. He saw the box. He saw her face. He sat down without being asked. She told him what she had found, not accusingly, not with the particular heat that would have been understandable. She told him the way she told most things, with a deliberate and considered flatness that had been one of the first things Ruth had noticed about her and had always privately admired. She told him about the deed, about the letters, about the photograph. She told him that she understood what he had done in 1883 and why he had done it, because his letter had been honest enough that she could hold the shape of it in her mind and see the reasoning, even if the reasoning was wrong. She told him that she was not going to undo what had been done, not because she thought it was right, but because she had looked at the reality of her life, the people in it, the years of it, the weight of it in each direction, and she had understood that the past is not a thing you can revise. You can only choose how to carry it. She said she was going to keep the box and its contents, that they were hers and had always been hers. She said she wanted a different kind of record, not an official one, because official records had already shown her what they were worth, but a personal one, an acknowledgement between herself and George and Ruth of what was true. George looked at her for a long moment. His hands were flat on the table. He nodded. Ruth, who had been standing in the doorway, said she had a letter she had written 3 years earlier. She went and got it from the sewing chest and brought it to the table and set it down. The full account, everything she knew and had worked out. She said she had always intended for Eliza to have it, that she was glad it was finally going where it belonged. Eliza read it there at the table. When she finished, she folded it and put it in the box with the other things and closed the lid. She asked George one question. She asked him what her grandmother Catherine had been like. George looked surprised. He said he had only met her twice when he was young, that she had been a quiet woman, a capable woman, that she had kept a garden and had an opinion on everything and expressed it whether asked or not. Eliza said that sounded about right. Then she put the box in her room, and she came back down, and she helped Ruth with the morning work, and the day continued in the way that days in a working household continue, through the ordinary movements of people who have settled something difficult and are now in the careful first hours of carrying it differently. Margaret came for Sunday dinner that week. After the meal, when the men were outside and the younger children were gone, She came and sat next to Eliza at the kitchen table and said very quietly that she had always known something, not what exactly, but something. Eliza looked at her. This woman she had grown up beside, this person who was not her sister by blood, but had been he, and her sister in every other way that had actually mattered. She told Margaret that she knew she had known, that it was one of the reasons she had trusted her. Margaret took her hand across the table and held it. Outside, the last of the autumn light was going gold across the fields. Next, we discover what became of Eliza in the years that followed, and why the photograph that had started all of this ended up in a water-damaged estate box, in a way that was not accidental at all. Chapter 12. What became of Eliza? Eliza Aldrich, which remained her name because it was the name of a person she had decided to inhabit with full knowledge rather than uncertainty, lived at the Harwick Station farm until she was 22. In the spring of that year, she wrote to an attorney in Pittsburgh regarding the deed in the box. Allegheny County land records showed the parcel was still in her family's name, having passed in legal ambiguity through the absence of any formal inheritance proceedings after Catherine Aldrich's death. The process of establishing her claim took 18 months, involved more correspondence than she had expected, and required George to provide a sworn written account of the family history, which he did, without complaint, in a document that was careful and clear, and that cost him considerably more than he showed. The parcel was small, not valuable in any grand sense, but it was hers, in the way that things are yours when a chain of people carried them toward you through difficulty and time. She sold it in 1893 and used the money to attend a teaching school in Philadelphia, where she was one of 12 women in a class of 40, and where she was described by her instructor in a letter of commendation as possessed of unusual patience and an extraordinary capacity to listen. She taught school for 31 years. She never married, not from bitterness but from preference. She had friends, good ones. She kept correspondence with Margaret until Margaret died in 1931. She returned to Harwick Station occasionally for Sunday dinners, and then less occasionally as the years went on, and the old generation of the house gave way to the new one, and then only for funerals, and then for none at all. She kept the iron box on a shelf in her room in Philadelphia, in the series of rented rooms, and then the small house she eventually purchased. She dusted, edit occasionally. She opened it sometimes and looked at the contents, the deed, the letters, Ruth's account, the tintype of the grandmother she had never met. She did not show it to people, not because she was ashamed of it, but because she had decided early that some things are for yourself and not for explanation. When she was 64 and beginning to feel the weight of planning, she added something to the box, a letter of her own, written in the voice of a woman who had spent her life listening carefully and had, in the course of that listening, worked out most of the things worth knowing. She wrote about what it meant to be placed at the center of something you did not choose. She wrote about the particular labor of carrying a name that was not originally yours and deciding through time and choice to make it yours. She wrote about George, with neither anger nor sentimentality, as a man who had loved his family badly in one specific and consequential way, and otherwise not badly at all. She wrote about Ruth, with something closer to gratitude than any other word she could find. She wrote at the end about the photograph. She wrote that she had always known why she had been placed at the center, not because Edmund Hale had made a compositional decision, though he had, but because families, when they arrange themselves for the record, place at the center the thing they are most afraid of losing. Sometimes that is the youngest, sometimes that is the most fragile, and sometimes it is the thing that, if removed from the center, would reveal the shape of what is missing. She wrote that she had spent a long time being uncertain whether she was the thing they were afraid of losing or the thing they were afraid of being found out. She had eventually decided it did not have to be only one of those things. She closed the letter. She put it in the box. She tied the box with new twine and placed it at the back of her closet with a piece of paper attached to the outside on which she had written in her clear schoolteacher's hand, "For whoever finds this, when it is time." Next, and finally, we discover how Clara Voss connected all of this in 2019, what she did with what she found, and why this story, which is fiction built on the architecture of real human patterns, asks something of everyone who hears it. Chapter 13. What Clara Voss found at the end of the chain. Clara Voss sat in her car in the parking lot of the Caldwell estate sale for 40 minutes after she left. She had the tin box on the passenger seat, She had paid $11 for it, not knowing what was inside, drawn by the kind of instinct that does not announce itself. Inside the box, she had found the oilcloth. Inside the oilcloth, the photograph, 2 letters, and the iron key. The first letter was Ruth's account, written in 1886 in a clear and careful hand. Clara had recognized immediately that she was reading something that was not meant for general eyes, something personal and specific, the kind of document that only exists because someone believed in the necessity of truth, even when the truth was inconvenient and late. The second letter was Eliza's, written in 1941 by a woman who would have been 65 and whose handwriting had the deliberate quality of someone who has spent decades writing on blackboards and marking papers and who no longer needed to think about the mechanics of a sentence to get it down. Clara read both letters. She read them carefully, the way she read everything, and she set them on the seat beside her and looked through the windshield at the estate sale, people moving in and out of the Caldwell house with their purchases wrapped in newspaper. She thought about what she was holding. She thought about the photograph, the child in the center. The child who had been placed there by a photographer following compositional principles, by a family arranging its official version, by a series of decisions made at a kitchen table in 1883, by people who were doing what they believed was necessary. The child who had grown up to teach school and keep letters and sit with an iron box and write at 64 years old, with the equanimity of someone who has sorted themselves out. For whoever finds this when it is time. Clara thought about what it meant that the box had ended up here. In a water-damaged estate at an auction in rural Pennsylvania, in the hands of someone with no connection to the Aldrich family, with no prior knowledge of this story. The chain of custody was not mysterious. Eliza's things had passed after her death to a neighbor who had been named in her will as the caretaker of her effects. The neighbor's family had held them for years without knowing what they contained. They had eventually been absorbed into a storage situation that became an estate situation that became a sale. The box had passed from one set of hands to the next across 78 years, none of those hands opening it, each of them sensing, perhaps, that it was the kind of thing that should not be casually opened. Clara opened it. She was, in the end, the person it was for. She thought about what she was going to do with it. She was a historical researcher. She had written 2 books about 19th century family records and the ways in which those records do and do not tell the truth. She knew what to do with documents, technically. She knew the archives, the institutions, the proper channels. She also knew, sitting in that parking lot, that what she was holding was not primarily a historical document. It was a human one. It was a woman's decision to leave a record, not for institutions, but for the unnamed person who would eventually be in the right place at the right time with the right kind of attention. She drove home. She read everything again. She stayed up very late. In the end, she wrote about it, not in an academic paper, in a different form, one that could be spoken aloud, that could travel through a voice, that could reach people the way the original story had reached her, through the particular quality of a thing that is both true and not true, that is made of real human patterns even when the specific names and dates are fiction, because that is what stories are for, not to provide a record, but to provide a shape you can hold against your own life and find, somewhere in the fit or the misfit, something that means something. Eliza sat in the center of a photograph in 1885, and she carried a secret that was not hers to carry, and she chose, after a long time, to carry it with knowledge instead of without. That is not a small thing. Most of us carry things we did not choose. The question is always what we do with the carrying. She wrote, in her letter, that the center of a frame is not always the place of honor. Sometimes it is the place of exposure, the place where the light falls first and longest, and where there is nowhere to hide. She did not seem to mind. Neither, perhaps, should we. Thank you for spending this time with this story. If it reached you in some way, if it made you think about the secrets that families keep and the children who carry them, consider sharing it with someone you think would appreciate it. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. There are more hidden stories waiting, and the people inside them deserve to be heard.